There's a particular branch of ghost stories that sees the dead appear to warn the living of their own impending death. They act as a form of death omen. Now, this isn't the same as those ghosts of the living that appear to family at the point of their death. These ghosts appear to offer help from beyond the grave. Yet these tales still display differences to create variety even within this trope. London has many such tales, but two of them caught my eye for different reasons while researching this episode. In one, a third party in a position to give aid sees the ghost. In the other, the dearly departed appears to their loved one to keep a promise. So let's investigate these tales of the returning dead in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. I do hope that you're well, and I do hope that your preparations for the winter holidays are going well as well. I suddenly realised after I'd put out last week's episode about the Hammersmith ghost that I'd completely forgotten to do the Sesame Street segment, which basically, if you haven't heard that part before, it's where I tell you which plant from the Victorian language of flowers is essentially sponsoring that episode. It's not actually sponsoring, it's just me being a bit silly, but anyway, as I forgot to do it, I thought, well, last week's episode is therefore brought to you by moonwort, which represented forgetfulness, and moonwort is actually a type of fern. And because of the fact that I've forgotten, I hope that you're patient with me because of that. This week's episode is brought to you by both dock and oxeye daisies, both of which meant patience. So there we go, I finally remembered to do them, even if I forgot in the first place. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the Hammersmith Ghost episode last week. I really enjoyed doing that one, because it's such an unusual tale. And obviously there's got a bit of tragedy in it as well. But I think the sudden link to Spring Heeljack at the end seemed to go down with people, particularly on YouTube, so that's good. But anyway, these two stories I actually found in The Law of the Land by Jennifer Westwood and Jacqueline Simpson, and I thought they were really interesting because of the fact that obviously they're both in London, although London itself isn't necessarily that important to the telling of the story, if that makes sense, but it's also the way that the stories kind of have some similarities, but then at the same time they do slightly different things, so let's have a look at them. So the first one was related by Charles Harper, although because those involved were apparently people of the highest social position, he never actually names them, which is helpful, I know. And like I say, this version comes from The Law of the Land. And it all begins at a church in Kensington. The vicar is locking up one evening after choir practice when a woman rushes into the churchyard. She's in a state of extreme distress, although the vicar has absolutely no idea who she is. She begs him to attend a dying man at a nearby house. According to her, the man is worried about his soul and wants to see the vicar before he dies. The vicar agrees to go with her in the taxi she has waiting. They arrive at the house and the vicar goes on ahead to ring the bell. When the butler answers the door, the vicar explains who he is and why he's there. But the butler looks a little bit confused and asks the vicar if he's in the right place. After all, his master is perfectly well. The vicar then turns to check with the lady, only to find that both she and the taxi have gone. Luckily, the man of the house then comes to the door and asks what's going on, and the butler explains what has just happened. The man actually explains that while yes, he is well, something is troubling him, and he had intended to speak to a clergyman. Obviously, this looks like just supremely good timing rather than anything suspicious. The vicar offers his services, presumably to avoid a wasted trip, and the pair speak for an hour. As the vicar leaves, the gentleman promises to continue their conversation the following morning at the church. You can probably see where this is going. The following morning, the gentleman doesn't turn up, so later that day the vicar goes to his house. He arrives to find it draped in black, and the butler sadly tells him the gentleman died the night before. It seems he died 10 minutes after the vicar left. The vicar goes into the gentleman's bedroom to pray for his soul, and he notices a portrait on the wall. He asks the butler who it is, explaining that she was the woman who had visited him in the church the day before. The butler sadly explains that she was the gentleman's late wife, who died 15 years before. Now, obviously, that's the kind of story where normally you would find that the vicar would discover that the gentleman had actually died sometime before the point that he actually spoke to him in most of these stories. So the fact he saw the gentleman's wife is what makes this one a little bit more unusual. Now, our other story of a London ghost comes from St James's Palace. Now, it originally came from an account by T.M. Jarvis in 1823, and it doesn't give any specific dates as to when this happened, though as it says, it does give us names, and Jacqueline Simpson and Jennifer Westwood place it in the 18th century. Now, we do actually have to go back to the 17th century for the very beginning of this story, to 1688. James II has been deposed, and his mistress, Madame de Beauclerc, has moved into St James's Palace. The Duchess of Mazarin, the former mistress of Charles II, also lives there, and the pair become firm friends. Aside from their status as former royal mistresses, they also share an interest in the afterlife, and the women promise each other that whoever dies first will appear to the other to tell her what death is like. Now, the Duchess actually renews her promise the day before she dies, although Madame de Beauclerc is disappointed that the Duchess's spirit doesn't appear as promised. Years pass, and Madame de Beauclerc still receives no sign from the Duchess. As she reaches old age, she loses her belief in the afterlife. Yet it actually seems that the Duchess instead had a knack for timing, and a younger friend of Madame de Beauclerc suddenly receives an urgent message. She must go to see the Madame or they'll never meet again. At first, the younger woman refuses because she's not feeling well, so Madame de Beauclerc sends a second message and some jewellery to sweeten the invitation. The younger woman agrees this time, but she's surprised to find Madame de Beauclerc in fine spirits and good health. Except, Madame de Beauclerc is also convinced that she will die the following day. How does she know this? Because the Duchess of Mazarin has told her so, of course. Madame de Beauclerc tells the young woman that the Duchess appeared in her room, walked around a little, and then stopped. She turned to look at Madame de Beauclerc and told her that between midnight and 1 a.m. they would be reunited. Madame de Beauclerc naturally wanted to ask her some questions about the afterlife, but the moment she opened her mouth, the Duchess disappeared. It was almost midnight when Madame de Beauclerc finally finished her story. She suddenly cried out that she was sick at heart, but despite the best efforts of the doctors, she died half an hour later, between midnight and 1 a.m. So what do we ultimately make of these stories? Well, there are plenty of tales of people appearing to someone else when they're on the point of death, and this often seems to happen when the person who is about to die is many miles away, and I do actually have an entire article about this particular phenomenon. And this is where you get stories of things like a woman has suddenly seen her son and she believed that he was away at sea, but the point that she sees him is actually the point at which he's then dying at sea, and so on. So that's usually how these stories go. But what's fascinating about these two stories is that the person who appears has actually been dead for some time, so they're an actual ghost, not an apparition of the living. Now, the ghost in the first story appears so that she can fetch help for her husband's soul only a couple of hours before he actually dies, so she obviously knows he's going to die in order to go and get the vicar to help him sort out whatever this issue was that had been troubling his conscience. Meanwhile, the Duchess appears mere hours before Madame de Beauclerc dies, apparently so she can fulfil her promise of coming back, and we will ignore the fact that she doesn't actually tell Madame de Beauclerc anything about the afterlife. The only thing we can glean from her words is that the Duchess is convinced they'll be reunited, but again it does demonstrate that she's aware of the point at which Madame de Beauclerc is going to die, so it does somehow imply that these ghosts do have some kind of preternatural knowledge of when their loved ones are going to come and join them in the afterlife. Now, are the stories true? Well, we don't really know. To be quite completely frank with you, we don't really know where the stories actually come from. Now, yes, the story of Madame de Beauclerc and the Duchess of Mazarin does have names involved, which do seem to confer a degree of authenticity, but we don't know who actually first recounted the story. T.M. Jarvis claimed that an unnamed narrator actually accompanied the younger friend to see Madame de Beauclerc, and it was this narrator who apparently somehow related the story, but we'll never really know. Jarvis insisted that others who were alive at the time the narrative was first published authenticated it, but bear in mind that Jarvis published his accredited ghost stories in 1823, and the Duchess died in 1699, so Madame de Beauclerc must have died sometime in the first half of the 18th century, so you're looking at that being at least 70 years, if not more, before Jarvis put his collection together. So I would be fascinated to know how Jarvis came across it in the first place. Now, I did go looking for a little bit more information, and according to Paranormal Database, both Madame de Beauclerc and the Duchess of Mazarin have actually been seen since. It doesn't give any more details than that, which is a little bit frustrating, but it does also complicate the story a little bit, because in both of these stories, a dead loved one has made an appearance before someone important to them dies. The first story, like I say, the dead wife is seeking spiritual help for her husband, although there's no suggestion that the gentleman himself actually sees her. And then the second story, the Duchess appears specifically before Madame de Beauclerc. Yet for Madame de Beauclerc and the Duchess to then appear to others adds in a bit of an extra layer. So we have to wonder, are they coming back to sort of spread the word about the afterlife to others, or are they simply reliving their time at the palace and other people happen to see them? Fundamentally, we'll never really know, and it's almost impossible to find any information about the Kensington one, because Kensington is actually quite a large area. It doesn't specify the church that the vicar works at, so again, it's really quite difficult to get any more information than that. But I think what we can really take away from these two particular stories is the fact that there was this abiding concern with what basically happens after you die, and I think both of these stories do have some kind of indication that the dead do continue to look after their loved ones from the other side, and they do continue to play a role in your welfare to one degree or another. Obviously, they can't actually prevent you from dying, but they can either, in the case of Madame de Beauclerc, they can at least provide comfort, because obviously Madame de Beauclerc seems absolutely thrilled that she's finally heard from the Duchess, even though the Duchess is saying, you're going to die soon. Madame de Beauclerc's kind of like, that's amazing, because she's going to see her friend again. And then I think in the story from Kensington, the very fact that the wife is so concerned about the state of her husband's soul that she wants to make sure he gets whatever it is off his conscience before he dies. Again, she's obviously demonstrating some kind of care and attention, but from the other side. And I think ultimately that's what these two stories have in common, which is kind of a comforting thought, the fact that even though these people may be physically gone, they haven't completely left your life in existence, and you may not be aware of them, but they're still keeping an eye on you to some degree. Now, that might also sound a little bit threatening, depending on who your loved ones are. But like I say, to other people, they might seem quite comforting. And I think the story of Madame de Beauclerc in particular, the fact that the two of them apparently have been seen since, it doesn't say if they're seen together, but I kind of hope that they are, because then A, it would prove that the Duchess was right, but B, it would also mean that they continue to kind of have an existence together, even after they've both obviously died quite a long way apart. So they're ultimately very interesting stories. Like I say, London is there kind of as a backdrop rather than a main character in these stories. And I think that in the Madame de Beauclerc story, yes, London's important because that's kind of how these two met, by being royal mistresses. But fundamentally, I think that the fact that you get these two stories in London really is more a testament to just the way that humanity rubs up against each other in such a vast, sprawling and ancient city. And I think that's where London does appear in these stories, kind of as that backdrop, because of the accumulated psychic landscape that it has. So please do feel free to let me know if you've ever heard any stories like these from where you are. I have no doubt that there will be stories like this all over the world, but just with different names. So if you've come across any of them, then obviously by all means feel free to let me know. You can post them in the comments, you can message me on social media, and we can have a bit of a chat about them. I'm always happy to hear about people's actual ghost experiences, or just stories that they have in their family as well. I mean, we've got one in my family where my granddad apparently woke up and he saw what he thought was, I think it was his uncle, at the bottom of his bed, and apparently being my granddad, he's like, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be dead, which just sounds like the kind of thing that my granddad would have said. So everybody's got stories like that in their family to some degree, and I always love hearing them, because I think, again, it just shows how this kind of stuff makes us more similar than different. But anyway, next week we're going to have a look at some ghost stories from the Tower of London, and considering A, the age of the place, and B, the amount of things that have happened within its walls, we've got quite a few to choose from. So there will no doubt be royal ghosts in there as well, because you kind of can't not have them. So yes, Anne Boleyn will be in there somewhere, and I hope that you enjoy that. I hope that you have a marvellous week ahead as well, and I will see you next week. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.